We'll produce a summary report describing the outcomes of this training series by early next year, and we'll make sure to let you all know when that report is available as well. Today's training session will include brief presentations by researchers studying climate-induced changes to land cover and land use across the Great Plains biome. Following the presentations and a short Q&A session for each one of our speakers, we will divide into breakout groups where we will elaborate on the topics presented and allow you to share your experiences. It is very important that we capture your knowledge and your needs so that we can help inform the development of additional webinars, research, and tools that will be most relevant to your work and your concerns. So please participate in the meeting polls, and there's one in front of you right now, and use the chat box to share your thoughts. Ultimately, we hope that communities of practice emerge from these sessions. We plan to document and share contact information for all participants to facilitate continuing discussions. If you do not want your information shared, please let us know by emailing Emma Custer, one of our facilitators for this session, but who couldn't join us today. And we'll put Emma's email in the chat box, and that's if you need to contact us for anything. Okay, so we can end the poll here. We'll do a quick screen capture. Okay, I got that. Go. Got that. Very good. We can stop the sharing. And let me introduce to you our first presenter, who is Dr. Jennifer Koch, Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Koch's primary research interest is the development of integrated approaches for modeling and analysis of coupled human-natural systems with applications for natural resource management, conservation planning, and sustainability solutions. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Koch. Please tell us what you know.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present to this group. I'm showing the work of an interdisciplinary team. The co-authors are listed here on this slide, and the title of the presentation is Modeling Water and Land Use Under Future Climates, an example for the Rio Bravo, Rio Grande Basin. So what's the motivation for our research? The motivation is that the Rio Grande is a transboundary river basin. It is large. It is more than 550,000 square kilometers and home to more than 10.5 million people. And the Rio Grande is one of the top 10 rivers at risk in the world. It is a very water limited basin, and the agricultural activity uses most, 90% of the surface water, while covering only 3.5% of the land area. Because water is so scarce in this basin, there's a complex structure of agreements and different water regimes that try to manage the distribution of water resources across the different parties involved here. And the basin is also highly engineered. So there's a lot of dams and irrigation infrastructure that is geared towards distributing water. As you can see in the map here on the right-hand side, this is also a highly heterogeneous basin with regard to ecoregions in the basin, right? So you have everything from forests over grasslands to deserts, and the Chihuahuan Desert actually covers the majority of the land area in this basin. So what we set out to do was to conceptualize the Rio as a socio-environmental system. So here we try to come up with a balanced approach where we give equal weights to the socio as well as environmental components of the system. This is something that is rarely done. There's obviously a lot of focus on the social system components in separation, the hydrological system components, and also on the technology in that basin, thinking about the lining of canals and ditches as an example. But given the importance of both the landscape and the agreements and all these social structures and entities in place to manage the water and the land resources, we tried to combine this into a modeling system that integrates knowledge and perspectives into a conceptual or simulation model and recognizes the importance of human decisions on the environment and vice versa. So we aimed to start from a model development perspective, which typically sets out with the development of a conceptual model, which was geared towards documenting and synthesizing both qualitative and quantitative information. The intention behind this was to understand the dynamic behavior of the Rio as a socio-environmental system. So how can we observe change over space and time? And with the intention of also building theory to improve models of socio-environmental systems in general. And since these are the steps to build a computer simulation model, we of course also set out to develop scenarios under future conditions, thinking about the social components of the system, but also the environmental system like climate. So we started out with ethnographic fieldwork. So over the course of 15 months, my colleagues went to the study area and conducted interviews. So they conducted semi-structured interviews with an average of 90 minutes per interview. They also conducted participant observation and on average spent 4 to 8 hours with each interviewee. All in all, more than 100 water managers were interviewed, including municipal managers, federal managers, irrigation district representatives, farmers, recreation people, and also tribes. And on the right-hand side, you can see 2 different maps. On the left-hand side, you see a map that includes dams, the main cities, and also the river itself. And on the right-hand side, you can see the spatial coverage of the interviews. So what we did here was not map the location of the interview, but I want to say the sphere of influence of the people interviewed, right? So who was responsible for which part of the basin? So that's what's displayed here. And you can see pretty much the number of people responsible for managing water resources in the respective spatial units. So our approach was then a 3-step approach to develop this conceptual model, synthesize data, and then implement the integrated simulation model. So this is the first result of a very time-consuming endeavor, which was asking our colleagues, based on the interview transcripts and their experience from participant observation, to develop a conceptual model of the socio-environmental system, right? So you can see that there are typical components included that one would see or expect to be included in a model like that. So you can see the importance of grazing, rangeland, agriculture, grasslands, shrubland, surface water runoff, irrigation, recharge, rainfall. You can see the importance of invasive species being represented, riparian vegetation, but also the importance of human control. For example, on the line of sight for the river, which is also influenced by riparian vegetation. And you can also see how these different components are connected, right? So we either have positive or negative relationships. If we have a positive relationship, that implies that the change goes into the same direction, right? A negative change would, a negative relationship implies that one of the factors goes up, which means that the other one goes down, okay? So just to give an overview. You can see that this is, of course, a highly connected system, which is also one of the reasons why we set out to approach this as a socio-environmental systems, to explore the relationships between the different system components. And that's also one of the things that makes these modeling endeavors highly time-consuming and also quite challenging. So the first thing that we realized when starting to implement the model as a spatially explicit model, we saw that our typical approach to simulating basins did seem to reach its limits here. So what we see mapped is the lower Rio Grande Valley irrigation districts in orange, and in white or black is the outline of the hydrological basin boundary. Okay, so what you can see is that a large amount of the irrigation district is actually outside the basin boundaries, which pretty much means that water from the Rio is used to irrigate areas outside of the basin. Right? So one of the first decisions we faced was, how do we define the spatial boundaries of our system? Right? Do we pretty much decide that we are going to use the standard hydrological approach and cut off those fields in our simulation model, or do we acknowledge the reality that we have water transport to areas outside of the basin? And we decided to go with the latter, which of course has implications for the hydrological modeling. Then the next thing we did was we developed a model of the actors in the system, right? So who are the entities that manage water, and how are they related? Okay, so that's given as a conceptual implementation here in this figure. And then the next thing we did was we developed decision rules. Okay, so based on the interviews and the participant observation, for each of our decision makers or actors in the basin, we came up with a database of general management strategies that are applied. And so you can see that we implemented those as like narratives, right? Based on a certain description of the landscape, a certain actor tends to make a certain decision that has this impact on the economy, on water use, on the land use. Okay? And you can see in this bar chart here on the lower right, the number of different management strategies we found for the different actor categories. So then once we had this conceptual frame developed for our model, we started to gather data as a pre-step also for the implementation of the simulation model. So in addition to being really useful for us as modelers, there's also a general need for these data synthesis activities, just because this is something that has to be done frequently, but is rarely shared. Okay, so especially when it comes to qualitative information sharing, the data collected is uncommon for obvious reasons, right? Yet there have to be ways to aggregate and synthesize this data that makes it still useful for other people to use while still being in line with the IRB and other, of course, important guidelines and laws in place. So what we did was we took those interviews, conducted a bibliographic review, and had several group meetings to identify this typology and the socio-environmental variables that, based on the conceptual model that I showed, were interesting to represent this system. So we then aggregated, joined, harmonized, translated, and processed these data sets that were of two different categories, vector data and raster data, and then produced a geodatabase with a total of 145 different data layers covering a set of 5 different categories, and published that as a geodatabase. The geodatabase is available through the Open Science Framework. I have the DOI listed here. And one example of the information that is included in this database is like a tree of the water management actors represented in this geodatabase, but also, since we're interested in spatially explicit modeling, the distribution of land ownership across the Rio, so this across the basin. So this is another like synthesis data product that was of highly relevant for us, but is typically not available in one data product, right? So we spend a lot of time just bringing together information from a lot of different sources. So after completing those 2 steps, we started with the implementation of our simulation model. So for this purpose, we used the Envision modeling framework. We have 3 major components: hydrological modeling, landscape modeling, and the modeling of decision makers. So for the decision making, I showed the major part, right? So we have the agents which make decisions on land and water resources. We have the hydrology, which is based on the rainfall runoff model HPV. A main focus here is on evapotranspiration and stream flow, which is due to the fact that we are also very interested in the landscape representation and how that changes over time, which of course affects evapotranspiration and also includes irrigation as a major process. And as input, we used climate data, different management scenarios, and in the future, we also hope to represent population growth and the effects on urban expansion. On the output side, we have stream flow.
Dr. Koch, we have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. Stream flow, water use, land use, and land cover, and a set of social indicators that the model produces. So how do we implement that? We try to combine information on a variety of spatial scales. Okay, so we have the stream network, of course, we have land cover, and we have different administrational entities thinking about counties that have different regulations and settings. And then we have the land ownership that is an important part for the decision-making on the respective piece of land. And so what we did was we integrated those different spatial scales into something that we refer to as integrated decision units. Okay, so in a GIS, in a geographic information system, they are represented through polygons. So we have different polygons. Each of those polygons has an actor assigned to it that was specified through the agent typology. So we have ranchers, tribes, public managers, urban decision makers, farmers, and then a large part of the landscape where there's no one necessarily responsible for making a decision, thinking about more natural areas there. And then we use these actors to select decision rules based on the environmental conditions. Okay, so once we progress into the future. This is how the modeling system looks like. Okay, so you can see in the background that we use climate information here for temperature and precipitation that of course changes over time, right? So this is then interpreted by the actor as the environmental setting in combination with a set of different factors, thinking about the current land cover, and their goals based on their agent typology they fall into. They may have different goals like higher production versus nature conservation. And so based on the environmental conditions, the individual actors choose a certain management for their piece of land, which they then implement, which is connected in a loop to affect, of course, the environment, which trickles through to the hydrology of the system and also affects the choices of the managers in the next time step. And here on the right-hand side, you can just see examples of the outputs of the modeling system, where we can look at stream flow, or another example, so we can show, we can change the visual in this modeling layout, where we could look at the land use and how land use changes over time based on the decision of the actors. So in terms of implementation, so what we make heavy use of is GIS, right? So we create those SQL queries where we use a lot of the landscape parameters like land use and implement them into like rules to be applied on this piece of landscape. So what we do is we translate the management rules that I showed earlier in the Excel table into those SQL decision rules, which are then applied to the landscape. What we achieve through doing this type of modeling is that we represent humans as encultured and an earth, right? So decisions are made in the context of the biophysical environment, but also in the context of the socio-cultural setting, right? So there's some neighborhood decision rules included here, right? So people close in terms of values, but also close in terms of space may influence decision making. And so we are pretty proud of this. But as I said earlier, bringing together all these different types of process-based simulation models is a pretty complex endeavor. And so we're still in the process of model testing. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Koch. You filled a lot of information there in a short amount of time, and we thank you very much. We've run out of time for questions and answers, but if you have any questions for Dr. Koch, please use the chat box to type them in, and we will be sure she gets those questions, and we'll have all of our presenters respond, but in text with those. So I'm going to move on to our second presenter today, Dr. Amy Simstad, research ecologist at the USGS Northern Prairies Wildlife Research Center. Dr. Simstad is a plant ecologist whose research seeks to advance the understanding of prairie plant communities, their natural and anthropogenic drivers, and management practices to sustain and restore them. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Simstad, and please enjoy it with me.
All right, thank you, Sean. And hopefully you're now seeing the correct slide.
Yes.
All right. Well, I am going to be talking today about woody encroachment into north central Great Plains grasslands, and specifically about management implications in a changing climate. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge a couple of folks. First of all, Jesse Nippert, who I have learned a fair amount about woody encroachment and the factors that affect it in a changing climate from. And then David King, Dominique Bachelet, and Ken Ferschweiler are the folks that I worked on in the project that, on the modeling project that I'll be presenting the results from today. As you know, one of the defining characteristics of the Great Plains is its broad grasslands devoid of trees. In pre-settlement times, woody species were largely confined to river corridors, protected draws, or rough topography. Woody encroachment is the expansion of these species into grasslands, which Dave Engel and his colleagues referred to as the Green Glacier. This encroachment displaces herbaceous species. It disrupts wildlife adapted to treeless grasslands. It reduces forage production for domestic and wild ungulates, and it can make any fires that occur considerably more intense. A thorough investigation of the degree of woody encroachment in grasslands of the northern and central Great Plains, my focus area, has not been done. However, a quick run of the Rangeland analysis platform app, which you can access online at the website on this screen, shows that shrub and tree cover have increased significantly in the Great Plains portions of Kansas, North Dakota, and Nebraska between 1986 and 2020, as shown by the solid lines in this graph. However, the 30-meter spatial resolution of the data used in this app aren't capable of capturing areas just starting to be encroached. For example, a recent study in southeastern South Dakota and northeastern Nebraska tripled the amount of area identified as being encroached by woody species when they used high resolution imagery compared to when using the 30-meter imagery that's available in the Rangeland analysis platform. So it's not surprising that even in states that don't show significant increases in woody encroachment in the graph on the left, those with the dashed lines, most land managers that responded to a survey I conducted nearly a decade ago perceived moderate to substantial encroachment in areas that they managed. In that survey, managers cited quite a few species as problematic, including native and exotic species, and evergreen conifers and deciduous hardwoods. But by far, the most often mentioned were species in the juniperus genus, especially eastern red cedar, the one in the upper left-hand corner. Understanding how climate change may affect woody encroachment requires understanding what drives the abundance of trees and shrubs on the north central Great Plains landscape. Climate, especially precipitation, is one of those factors, with the potential woody cover generally increasing as total precipitation increases, which in the northern half of the Great Plains is generally from west to east. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is another factor, especially in grasslands dominated by C4 grasses. And this is because C3 species are expected to benefit more from increased CO2 than C4 species are, and our woody species are C3. The soil moisture profile is also important because grasses tend to use shallow water, whereas shrubs rely more on deep water. This profile varies with soil type and precipitation timing, where precipitation and timing includes things like the relative amount of precip that falls during dormant and growing seasons. It also includes whether the rain falls in short but intense thunderstorms or as gentle soaking rains. Both of these are things that are expected to change as our whole atmosphere warms. The potential woody cover isn't what we see on the landscape, though, because other factors prevent woody species from reaching this full potential. Some of the major factors are fire, grazing, and browsing. They affect woody species directly by killing or injuring them, but they also affect grasses, which compete with woody species and provide fuel for fires, thereby indirectly affecting the woody species. Other factors affecting actual woody cover are seed sources for the woody species and landscape connectivity for its effects on fire and seed spread. We used a dynamic global vegetation model to compare effects of many of these drivers on woody encroachment in the pink and the dark blue ecoregions shown on this map. Our tool was MC1, a model that simulates vegetation type, biogeochemical cycling, and dynamic fire in a highly interactive manner. We customized the model for the Northern Great Plains in a variety of ways, including adjusting tree production, fuel characteristics, and fire parameters for ponderosa pine in the western half of our study area and eastern red cedar in the eastern part of our study area. One aspect of a dynamic model is that it has a discrete starting point, and the endpoint depends on what happens in between. In a minute, if I can get my Zoom cloud to move out of the way. Okay, in a minute, I'll run this movie on the screen here to show how things changed for one of our model runs from 2006 to 2100. To make it possible to run many simulations in a reasonable amount of time, with no supercomputer, we subset the region into these large cells. You can see the size of one of them here, which are a ½ degree of latitude and longitude on a side. Before I start the movie, I'll point out a couple of other things. First, the blue line going down kind of the middle delineates the boundary between the eastern and western portions of the study region, with ponderosa pine being the dominant encroacher in the western and eastern red cedar in the east. Second, I want you to know that MC1 is spatially explicit because the climate and soils input are spatially are specific to each of these cells, but because its cells are independent, it does not account for landscape connectivity. However, it does account for almost all the other factors that I mentioned. MC1 output can be made into somewhat mesmerizing movies like those that you just saw in Dr. Koch's presentation. The one I'll show today here represents the response variable of interest in this talk, which is forest or woody species carbon. In the color scheme that you see on this map, the darker cells the darker cells represent higher forest carbon. You can see in 2006, our beginning time, most of the region starts out with little or no forest because of the light colored cells. The darker cells in the western portion of the study region are areas of higher elevation or rougher topography that currently have some forest, with this darkest cell in the upper left or northwest representing a thick forest where little light penetrates to the ground. Now, as I run the video, pay attention to the timestamp at the top. The main point of showing this time series is to illustrate that even in this scenario, which is one of the most extreme in terms of woody encroachment, changes in forest carbon don't become noticeable until around the year 2050. Because of that, all that I present today will be for the year 2100. And I realize that's a bit far out for management purposes, but if there's time during the Q&A session, I'll explain why I think these results are still relevant for the nearer term. We use the survey I mentioned earlier to determine reasonable scenarios for the simulations. These scenarios represent not only what currently occurs on the landscape, but also what managers wish that they could accomplish. The table shows the levels of each of the driving factors that were used to in the 11 scenarios in various combinations. And I'm just presenting the highlights of the results that are most relevant for our topic today. And in those results, I'm going to move through the slides pretty quickly. I'll start with images like those I just showed in the movie, then wrap up with a different color coding scheme. These images, I admit, contain a lot of information that I don't expect you to digest. Instead, just consider the slides as background for the summaries that I'll provide verbally and capture in the slide's title. So just one more bit of information in looking at the images. In the next few slides, the small figure at the top left is the starting point of the simulations, so barely any woody cover, and the larger graphs show the 2100 endpoint. So in terms of the driving factors, I'll start with the CO2 effect, basically to get it out of the way. As you all know, carbon dioxide is not only a greenhouse gas, but is also food for plants. But this food and the way that plants access it is tied to water availability and temperature in relatively complex ways. Ecological models projecting future vegetation should therefore take this food role and these complexities into account. Our model does incorporate the food role of CO2, and it shows a substantial CO2 effect on woody encroachment. In fact, doubling forest biomass by letting CO2 increase instead of keeping it steady. And doubling that allows for doubling forest biomass in some areas of the east in both the cool and wet and very hot and dry climates. These CO2 effects are sometimes as strong as climate effects, which suggests that representing CO2 effects correctly is important. And I said earlier that I wanted to get this effect out of the way because the accuracy of the simulated CO2 effect is limited by available data on plant growth responses to elevated CO2. And there isn't much of this kind of data for the trees that we used as our model encroachers, or mature trees of any kind for that matter, or the grasses that compete with them in the Great Plains, and especially in the longer term context. The sometimes limited information used in models like MC1 may make you ask why you should believe any of the results that I present at all. And I'll just answer by quoting the old adage, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And also to point out that better information on CO2 effects would make this model even more useful. But our information base for other driving factors is stronger, so let's turn to them. We'll start looking at those factors first with the 4 climates that we used in our scenarios. In addition to the different climates, the management scenario that I'm showing here is one of fire suppression, light grazing, and low juniper regeneration capacity in the east. As you can see by the variety of colors in the 4 panels representing the 4 climates, woody encroachment potential does vary among future climates. The dark colors in the top 2 panels show the most substantial woody encroachment in the east when there's plenty of moisture and mild temperature increases. In the west, forest carbon can decrease in some cells, even in the relatively cool and wet climate, because in our parameterization, fire suppression does not mean no fire, it means only the most difficult to control fires occur. In other words, when fire conditions are most extreme because of weather and fuel conditions, fires will occur. If fires occur frequently enough, forest carbon decreases. So you'll see that in the east, woody encroachment occurs even in the very hot and dry climate under this management scenario. For simplicity's sake today, the rest of the slides will use only the two most different climates, the upper left relatively cool and wet climate and the very hot and dry climate in the lower right. Climate and CO2 are outside of local land managers' control, but managers do have substantial influence on when prescribed fires occur. Thus, we examine the role of burn season in conjunction with climate change. In the cool and wet climate, fall burns at 10-year intervals basically maintain the current state. Summer and spring burns at the same interval allow more encroachment, but still a very modest amount compared to what was seen in the previous slide of fire suppression. In the very hot and dry climate, frequent summer fires not only maintain no trees in the east, but wipe out almost everything in the west, and fall and spring burns basically maintain the starting point. These differences among seasons are driven by different tree mortality rates, which depend on the weather conditions at the time of the fire. Mortality is higher in the fall in the cool and wet climate. Based on our survey of managers, spring is the overwhelmingly preferred time for conducting prescribed fires in the northern Great Plains, but our simulations suggest that in a cool and wet climate, fall fires would be better at controlling woody encroachment. However, what this really means on the ground is that burning at times when fires will be hotter is important for controlling woody encroachment.
Excuse me, Dr. Simstad, you have about 4 minutes left.
Okay. In the eastern portion of the region, juniper has been widely planted in shelter belts or supposedly to improve wildlife habitat. To represent the fact that this makes seeds for regeneration much more available than what is natural, we adjusted a parameter in our model that essentially represents the regeneration capacity of trees. This slide compares the low regeneration capacity on the left, which is the same as the frequent spring fires and moderate grazing scenario from the last slide, to the high regeneration capacity scenario on the right. In the very hot and dry climate, there's no effect of this enhanced regeneration. In the cool and wet climate, though, this seed source effect is quite large. Even frequent fires can't keep up with constant replenishment of the juniper stock. Combining many of these management components into distinct scenarios helps us envision the overall effect of management in different climates. Our optimal scenario, which we defined as the one with the endpoint closest to the starting point, is a regime of moderate grazing, fall fires every 10 years, and low regeneration capacity. This occurs in a few cells in the region that I know of, such as in a couple of Park Service units. The current scenario of moderate grazing, but a spring fire occurring only once every 40 years, is like many private lands or Forest Service or BLM lands with grazing leases. The minimal management scenario has light grazing and fires are suppressed. And finally, the worst case scenario represents hard hit areas where grazing is severe, fires are suppressed, and there is ample seed source for the woody species. It's interesting to note on this slide that the minimal management scenario results in less encroachment than the current scenario in both climates. And this is because by the end of the century, wildfires are occurring more frequently than once every 40 years. Another way to look at the results of these simulations is to compare the influence of climate to the other driving factors. In the interest of time, I won't explain the color scheme here, but instead jump to the point. If fires are frequent and occurring under conditions likely to kill woody encroachers, it doesn't much matter what the future climate is, woody encroachment can be minimized. But these figures also show that if the current practice of relatively cool fire continues, even a very hot and dry future climate won't prevent woody encroachment. So my time is up, and I'll just wrap up by sharing this slide, which basically summarizes what I just said, and maybe we have time for a couple questions.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Simstad. We do have one question, and I'll allow us a minute here to address it. Christian, your question is a little vague, but in case you can't read it in the chat box, Dr. Simstead, Christian asks, are these shapes just a random simulation, or do they represent a particular geography?
They represent, they don't necessarily have topographical features. They have features that represent soil texture and how that affects the soil water profile.
Well, great, thank you. I invite Christian to embellish on his question a little bit more, and we can get that to Amy afterwards for a little bit more detailed response to it. But otherwise, we're going to move on now. Thank you very much, Dr. Simstead. It was great information. And our third speaker today is Dr. Shelley Crosby. She is a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners. Dr. Crosby is a plant community ecologist, ecological modeler, and a paleoecologist. Her research focuses on triggers of ecological state change, climate drivers of vegetation patterns and dynamics, and the role of disturbance within a changing climate context. Welcome, Dr. Crosby, and thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. With deep apologies for the technical difficulties this afternoon, I wanted to offer this recording of my presentation in case it was useful or helpful to you in any way. And sorry for the inconvenience there. I wanted to talk about resisting, accepting, or directing ecological transformation in the Great Plains. And my talk is going to have three parts. First, just exploring ecological transformation and what it is. Second, a little exploration of the Rad Framework. And third, just some thinking about ecological transformation in the Great Plains, largely based on the paleo record. I wanted to start right where Amy left off with this really cool modeling approach to try and understand where tree encroachment is a threat. And I would say that's quite an ecological transformation to see our Great Plains and our grasslands turning into woodlands or forests. And this is actually quite similar to the kinds of changes that are happening across the globe, some of which you've probably seen in the popular literature. So for example, this article on whether this is the end of forests as we've known them because of severe droughts and severe wildfire, or severe wildfire that exists in a place that it normally doesn't so much and really burning these beloved Joshua trees, or a huge heat extreme that occurred in the ocean that really killed a lot of marine animals. These kinds of ecological transformations are happening more and more. They're getting more attention. And we recently defined ecological transformation as the dramatic and irreversible, at least on a manager's timescale, right, shift in multiple ecological characteristics of an ecosystem. But the basis of that is a high degree of turnover in ecological communities. So species replacement, species turnover, one species replacing another. I wanted to show this global map of the amount of ecological transformation that's happening today. So where there are colors other than gray, we actually have data. And from there, we can determine that species have been replaced at a median rate of about 28% per decade. So 28% of the species are, have totally replaced what used to be there. You can see with the colors that the blue areas are having species replacement at a much higher rate. So they've turned over even more. And then the places in the darkest red are next. And you can see right here in the Great Plains is actually experiencing some of the lowest turnover rates that we've measured globally, which is really heartening. We don't often have good news in webinars like this, but this is maybe a good one. I wanted to explore a little bit about how pervasive ecological transformation was in the paleo record. So here's a global map that shows different sites in how large, moderate, or low the compositional shift, the species assemblage on the left versus structure on the right. And this is all vegetation data. So like, how large was the compositional change from the last glacial maximum when temperatures were quite a lot different to today? And you can see that, transformation in vegetation has been absolutely pervasive. The world does not look like it did 20,000 years ago. If you take that understanding for how that degree of change relates to temperature change, and then you try and project into the future with these two different RCP scenarios, you can see that the threat of future transformation really is, frankly, everywhere. And so with this situation happening, conservation practitioners, land management agencies, folks are really grappling with how to rewrite our conservation strategies as nature is shifting in such a dramatic way. And so this is where the Rad framework comes from. I'll just talk to you a little bit about it here and what it means. So resist, accept, or direct. Resisting, we're talking about resisting an ecological trajectory. So you're going to work to maintain, or maybe you need to restore the species composition, the structure or function, and sort of keep your current historical conditions, keep that trajectory from moving out into a totally new community. Or you're going to accept the changes that are just going to happen autonomously because of climate change or because of global change. You'll accept that complete turnover of the community, or you can direct it and actively shape the direction, the ecological trajectory your system takes. So the Rad framework, we recently put a special feature out in Bioscience. This came out in January of this year. And there's 5 different papers plus a little intro viewpoint paper that kind of explore multiple different facets of the Rad framework. So the first paper by Skierman et al. Really talks about Rad as part of a paradigm shift. And so right here, I think it's important to say that, Rad is not the only framework that could help you make decisions about ecological transformation. And that's what's actually really cool, is there are a lot of frameworks that are absolutely confronting this head on, like the RRT framework and others like it, that are saying, look, we maybe can't have resilience. Things are shifting. We need to incorporate that. So this paper really explores that sort of history and thinks about it as a paradigm shift. It explains that Rad is really simple because it focuses on manager intent. A manager is intending to resist a trajectory, accept a trajectory, or direct a trajectory. These are all the possible options that a manager has in response to ecological transformation. We would argue there's nothing outside of these 3 bins. It's super simple and it's absolutely neutral. It gives a framework so that managers can think about how their goals fit into these different bins. Okay, the second paper is led by Don Magnus and others. And the questions explored there are what are the sequence, the timing, the methods of intervention that we could use to achieve a preferred future ecological condition. So where Don works in the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, right now, the Lutz spruce forest is transforming into a blue joint grassland due to wildfire, drought, beetles, all kinds of stuff. And this is a change that maybe these land managers don't want to accept. And so what Don is exploring is what are the management pathways we could take to get from one kind of community composition to a different sort of desired ecological condition. And what are those pathways, and what are the junctions along the way where you're going to make a Rad decision and try and bend the ecological trajectory into a certain direction. We need new science to figure out what these methods and interventions are. Abby Lynch and others explored how we could really incorporate the Rad framework into adaptive management. And so she has some inner loops and middle loops and outer loops of a typical adaptive management process. And then Katie Clifford and others really explored some social science factors and thinking about the manager themselves and how managers make decisions. What are their external constraints? What are their internal constraints? There's a lot that goes on. Obviously, you guys know this in terms of making a management decision. And then finally, the last paper was one that I led with a bunch of other folks. And we tried to ask how science and scientific information could really help operationalize Rad decision-making and make this real. And so we used a really generalized decision-making process that I show here, and trying to think what is the scientific information that needs to be at the table to make Rad decisions. And first and foremost, you need to understand whether transformation is a threat, to your ecosystem that you manage. That's what brings you to the Rad decision-making table. Question 2, how effective, but most importantly, how durable are resistance strategies? Question 3, what are the plausible ecological futures? What does acceptance look like? We might know when we're going to lose a forest, for example, but sometimes it's hard to know what it's going to transition into. The final 2 questions are social science questions, which focus on what are the consequences of our choices to resist, accept, or direct in terms of human communities. And then finally, how do we even make these choices about the threat of ecological transformation? What are our processes there? I want to offer one example to try and tie it all together, and then we'll get back to grasslands. So this is from Acadia National Park in Maine. Here, folks are managing a red spruce forest, and there are 2 plausible scenarios for the future. One is that it transitions into a non-native shrubland. 2, and this is what species distribution models tell us, is that it's going to transition into a broadleaf forest, which is both of these are dramatic, changes to a red spruce forest. So the national park decided, they really don't want to accept this invasive species in a lot of cases. So they're going to have to do that in some places. So what they wanted to have was sort of a landscape portfolio approach where they find places where they can really work to resist, to control those invasive species, and try and maintain that red spruce forest. They're also going to look for some places where they can direct pretty effectively. And so right now they have common garden experiments where they're trying to determine which of these broadleaf species would do best. And maybe they want to start outplanting them in certain places. Okay, so that was an example, and now I just want to get you back to grasslands for a minute and thinking about ecological transformation. And I often feel like starting actually kind of deep in the paleo record is a good way to think about this stuff, because it sort of loosens you up and gets you primed for some of the changes that are coming in the future. And so I want to start with us around 18 or 20,000 years ago, where the glaciers were at their maximal extent. And I just want to point out that in this place we know of as the Great Plains, from probably 2 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago, this was a spruce forest. It was a spruce parkland, spruce forest with interspersed wetlands. The evidence is literally everywhere. After about 14,000 years ago, grasslands did in fact return to the Great Plains, obviously. And I can call this the Golden Glacier, much like Amy referred to tree encroachment as the Green Glacier. Grasslands were moving northward and eastward as the glaciers receded. And as they got to their nearly modern extent, there was many thousands of years in which there were dynamics of where this ecotone between the prairie and forest occurred. And all of those dynamics were really driven by fire, they were driven by rainfall, and they were driven by these positive vegetation fire feedbacks. CO2 wasn't quite the issue that it is today. But what's enticing here is that some of the mechanisms that we're worried about, that we're trying to understand more about today, were absolutely going on in the past, and they caused a pretty dynamic ecotone. The interior of the Great Plains was also dynamic over the Holocene, mostly due to some changing amplitude of the wet-dry cycles, including mega droughts that occurred during this time. These droughts could last 80 years or more. Sometimes there were repeated drought-induced disturbances coupled with some pretty wet summers, maybe some situations that we wouldn't find so much today, but these kind of drivers caused even the interior of the Great Plains to have a different community composition in terms of the grasses and forbs, as we move through time. Some of the work that we see today, right, just focusing on drought and thinking about internal grassland dynamics, we know that drought can in fact cause long-lasting changes to composition. It can sometimes favor invasive species. It could either promote or maybe reverse woody encroachment. It could even paradoxically favor species that are more drought sensitive, maybe because they're really fast growers or what have you. But one thing that seems really interesting in some of the experimental drought plots is that identical plots on time 1 can take totally different ecological trajectories after drought. So there is a lot of stochasticity in this environment, right? There's a lot of different directions that ecosystems could go. And in some ways that's kind of good news, because it means there's many, if you think about Don Magnus's paper, there are many points along your management pathway where you could make a rad decision and pull a trigger and take the ecological trajectory in a different place. So I just wanted to end by saying, you know, it seems like some of the work that Amy and so many others have done in Grasslands are showing that the trajectory of ecological change really can be heavily influenced by management, whether it's prescribed fire, trying to improve connectivity, thinking about seeds and seed sources, or grazing. You know, all that stuff is, you know, plays a really heavy hand in these grasslands and has since the Holocene, well, and before that too, certainly. So it's maybe an interesting place to think about the Rad framework. Maybe acceptance isn't something that would happen as often in these grasslands, but maybe you do have a lot of tools in your toolkit to resist whatever transformation may be coming your way. Or conversely, maybe you have a lot of tools in your toolkit to be able to direct to that desired ecological condition you're looking for. You know, whether you're in the interior of a grassland or on some ecotonal, you know, grassland woodland edge. Hopefully some of these concepts have been helpful, and I'd just like to thank the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center for funding some of my thinking on this, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby. It looks like Elise Elliott-Smith has a question. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, Elise.
Yeah, thanks, John. This question is for Dr. Simstad. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you selected your projections, the different projections, and also I noticed that you had the cool in parentheses for cool and wet. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that means. And I have another question if there's time, but.
Okay. Yeah, the cool was in parentheses because all of the scenarios that we used obviously showed warming temperatures over the time frame, and this was one of the ones that warmed the least. The scenarios that we chose were based in part or like I said, we did this survey of managers in the area to kind of get an idea of what the range of grazing levels and fire frequencies were. And we put those together to, as in the the theme of scenarios, to make different stories, and also to kind of represent different land management practices, like might occur in private land versus public conservation areas, like parks versus forest service areas where fire is not tolerated. We obviously couldn't do all possible combinations of all those factors, but that's what we tried to do with the scenarios, is to get realistic combinations of these factors.
Okay, Elise, I'm not seeing anyone else with a hand raised or any questions in the chat box. Looks like you got another one.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your response, Amy. I guess, well, a follow-up to that question, I guess, is like looking at like average projections. Do they seem like, looking at the range of different modeled climate futures, where do you think, I mean, it seemed like when I was looking that wetter is a more common prediction for the region, and so I just was wondering if you could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I actually did plot these out against kind of the suite of climate projections that are available, but it would take me a little digging to figure out exactly where they fell in there. And so yeah, sorry, I can't answer that.
That's okay. No, I think it's really interesting to see how different projections really change the storyline. Mm-hmm. And
that's the point, is that we don't know exactly where we're going. That's where I think it's important to look at the relative effects of these fairly extreme differences in climate to the relative effects of maybe not so extreme differences in management practices.
Absolutely. my other question was about wildfire and using it as a management tool. And it seems like it may become more increasingly important to use it as a management tool to prevent woody encroachment. And as a caveat, I live out in Oregon, so I'm not as familiar with the grasslands that you were studying, but I'm curious about whether there's concerns with using wildfire about it changing the grassland species and invasives.
So one thing to keep in mind is that these grasslands, for the most part, are evolved with relatively frequent fire intervals. So a 10-year fire return interval that we used as kind of our optimal is along the lines of what is thought to have occurred before we started mucking around with things, before white people got here, basically. So in terms of the native species, they should be able to tolerate that. Of course, once you throw in novel species that interact with those native species differently, then our understanding is much less complete, or our assumptions aren't as strong as, yeah, these can handle it because that's what they evolved with. But I think it's not the same in the Great Plains, where the native species evolved with frequent fires, as it is further west, where the shrublands are not tolerant of the frequent fire, and that the annual grasses change that for the more frequent, making it worse. I think that hit on most of what you were talking about or asking about.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Definitely. Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna have to shut Elise off over here. She's full of questions, but thank you very much. And thank you, Amy and Shelley and Jennifer, for your great information. One of the reasons we have this training workshop in the first place is to start to think about collectively what we're going to do about that. And the science that we heard today and other science that's available gives us some information, but a lot of it comes down to management decisions. And that's why you were all invited here today. So.